Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Deprogrammed on Unsafe Space. I am your host, Carter Laren, and I'm here with Keri. Keri, do you want to do a quick shout out?
Who should I shout out?
I don't know. Just hi. Just shout out to everyone.
Hi, guys.
I guess shout out's the wrong word. All right, I sound old right away. I'm using the wrong language. I'm not dope. As always, you can follow us at Unsafe Show on Twitter. You can go to unsafeshow.com, and there's ways to support the show and whatever. Like us, follow us, podcast. You follow us on podcasts, all that kind of stuff.
You can go to Facebook, Deprogrammed podcast.
Yes.
And Unsafe Show.
Yes, it's all over the place. And hopefully the video switching is working this time. I guess we'll find out later. I found out last time that mostly it was me talking and Keri's face, or Keri talking while I was like getting up and doing stuff, not
and changing clothes.
Yeah. So I'm not going to change my clothes this episode, regardless. So
it's a good thing it was just your jacket, not your pants.
Right. Well, who knows that I'm wearing pants, Keri?
Right.
That's you're making an assumption. So today we're going to talk about we're going to ruin comedy by talking about it, because I think it's hard to talk about comedy because talking about comedy makes it boring. There was a really great quote. I'll paraphrase. I don't remember what it was, but it was something like studying comedy is like dissecting a frog. Like it's no one like something about like the frog doesn't do well and no one likes it and it's unsatisfying. And I just butchered even that. So, Keri, you spent a large part of your career as a manager of professional comedians, which I guess we will, out of courtesy, even though most of them are social justice warriors, we will not name their names, because name dropping them here, they would suddenly be associated with you. And I think we've established already that you are a horrible Nazi. So,
yes.
We won't drop their names.
It's weird because I try not to call people social justice warriors, only because I try to make it about what a person's beliefs are rather than naming them. I mean, sometimes it's very clear, like this person is an SJW, but when I'm thinking about it and when I'm careful with and trying to be precise in what I'm saying, I'll just say, you know, they subscribe to SJW beliefs or they subscribe to that ideology. Which I selected comedians who did that. I mean, not all of the comedians I worked with primarily worked in that ideological space, but most of them did. And that was because I chose that. Like I got into entertainment not because I cared about entertainment. I never had a burning desire to work in entertainment like some of my colleagues did, I guess. I was really a true believer about SJW, the belief system. And so a lot of the comedians I was following, like I became a big fan of, I was a big fan of George Carlin and Bill Hicks, Richard Pryor. And then I started working with Margaret Cho.
George Carlin was like the opposite of an SJW.
Exactly. But see, here's the thing. Before it got out of control, what I saw in like Margaret's work, for example, was someone who's willing to talk about issues of the day and to push the envelope and to be transgressive even with comedy. And I sort of viewed what I was doing as like, I want to work with people who are changing the world, and that whole SJW trope that I hate about like being on the right side of history. But I really was like, you know, I want to use entertainment and comedy to spread what I believe about the world and to do it in a humorous way. And I always felt like it's easier to teach people something with humor than it is to just have a lecture. And that's true. But what I didn't realize was that like a lot of the stuff we talked about with this ideology, I was pushing something that I now believe ultimately to be evil. It's just that I thought it was good. And it also, there's a difference between maybe opening people's eyes to something with humor and then indoctrinating them and not even being funny while you're doing it. Right. So
let's actually back up and give a little bit of history, because this has been in the news a lot lately, partly because Kevin Hart I don't know if he was. I think he's voluntarily stepped down from hosting the Oscars, but it was pretty clear that that was what everyone wanted. And so, and there's.
Well, just to quickly, as an aside, I had someone say to me in an argument about this, well, he chose to step down. I'm like, dude, you can believe that if you want. I don't know what the truth is. The point is, I mean, I worked in entertainment. Right. People come up with lies all the time about why their client's not doing a show. You want to save face, whatever. You don't want it to look like you got fired or whatever the reason is. Or you don't want to do a show and you're tired and you really don't want to travel to Albuquerque and then you say you're sick. You know what I mean? Like people come up with reasons all the time.
Well, this happens in the executive world all the time. It's like, you're going to tender your resignation now. It's like, all right.
Sure. You're resigning. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'll resign. But anyway, maybe you can kind of step back and give us a little bit of history, because you reminded me the other day that I was years ago, even Jerry Seinfeld was talking about not doing comedy on college campuses. Maybe we can talk about why way back then it started to be an issue and kind of what's it's maybe culminated in this Konstantin Kisin incident the other day. Maybe you can just kind of walk us through and talk about what's happened and kind of where we are today.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, comedy when it's at its best, I believe, is you're making fun of, and this is where I kind of agree with SJW ideology. You're making fun of the powerful. Sometimes you're pointing out absurdities. It's like the court jester. You're bringing them down to earth, and that's a kind of comedy that I think I agree with SJWs would say. Well, there's a popular thing that SJWs say about comedy, and it came from Molly Ivins. They say that comedy, the best comedy, is punching up, not punching down. And what they mean by that is the best comedy is making fun of someone who's powerful and not making fun of someone who doesn't have power, right? So like it's considered cruel to make fun of someone who's already a victim or oppressed or what have you. Where I differ with them, I agree with that for the most part, but where I differ with them now is that they don't know which way is up or which way is down. And we've seen this with the way they define power. So if they're saying punching up is making fun of the powerful and punching down is making fun of people who don't have power. Well, I don't trust you to define power, SJWs. Their definition of power is not how much an individual's ability to exert force on someone else or to get what they want in the world, my individual power. They define power based on what groups I belong to. So it's a completely collectivist point of view. It's not an individualist point of view. So therefore you can take something like, people who were doing jokes about Bruce Jenner before he transitioned to Caitlyn Jenner, that would be punching up because he's a straight white guy and he's successful and he's rich and he's a celebrity. And as he was starting, it was a great article about this, as he was starting to go through his transition, or people didn't know what was going on with him. He was just acting more eccentric or whatever. And some of the late night comedians, like even Conan O'Brien, were making jokes about him and maybe guessing that he was about to transition or something. And as soon as he did transition and came out as a woman, then all of a sudden it's like, now he's in a protected, now he has no power. All of those jokes are now transphobic and those jokes are now punching down. Well, no, they're not punching. As an individual, he is a powerful figure. Like, it is still fine in my punching up to make fun of him. You're not going to be doing great harm to Caitlyn Jenner. So I disagree with them on when it comes to defining power and what is punching up versus down. I don't trust them. They don't know directions. So,
sure.
So that's where but wait a minute. We were supposed to talk about how things changed, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so just some examples, because I'm not sure everyone is even aware. So one of the ones that I think is kind of funny, and it's we referenced it actually. When I made the show graphic for this show, there was a YouTube guy named Count Dankula in the UK, and his girlfriend had a pug named Buddha, I think was the pug's name. And while she was on vacation, he thought it would be funny to teach the pug to do a Nazi salute when he said Sieg Heil.
He even said, can I interrupt? He even said, while my girlfriend was on vacation, I thought it'd be funny to turn her adorable dog into the worst thing I could imagine, a Nazi.
Right. Which was a Nazi, right?
Like,
so
yeah,
this is a horrible thing.
Yeah.
I'm going to take this cute pug and turn it into this horrible thing. And so, and he did, and he made a video of it, and he was convicted in UK court. He was fined, what, 800 pounds. He didn't end up doing jail time, but he was convicted of basically a hate crime. I mean, different language.
He had to go to court. He had to get a lawyer. He had to, I mean, he was, and they found him guilty.
Yep. They found him guilty.
And you know what?
Nobody
was speaking about, like, the only mainstream comedians I saw defending him and talking about it, I saw Ricky Gervais talking about it. I can't recall any others. Like, all of the US comedians who are always virtue signaling on Twitter, all the ones who've, like, I like to say SJWism is sort of like a virus and it's catching. And all the ones that have caught it, who are always the first to insert themselves into politics and to tweet stuff that's not comedy, that's just like their opinions on what's happening in the world. None of them were commenting on it. Cowards.
Right. And so, and I guess Owen Benjamin is kind of another classic example of someone who's been, he lost his contract, and like, you know, a little bit more about Owen Benjamin and what's happened to him recently. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but.
Yeah, well, there were a few of them. Before I talk about Owen, there are two others in Canada. So the one you're talking about, Count Dankula, and I forget his real name is like Meacham, Mark Meacham or something.
I think it's Meacham, yeah.
Meacham. So there was him. But then in Canada, in the past, 8 or 9 years, I know of two different comics who faced charges for, one of them was, wait a minute, I wrote their names down so I don't forget. Guy Earl. So Guy Earl was charged with, he made a joke about two lesbians who were heckling him, and he called them dykes. And while he made it, and this is what comedians do all the time. If they're being heckled, they will oftentimes make fun of the hecklers, and
right, they punch back.
They punch back, right? And one of the women ended up suing him, and I think it was the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and he was fined with $15,000 to pay this woman for PTSD because of him making a joke about her at a comedy show. And that's in Canada. Yeah. And then a few years later, so 2017, Mike Ward, same thing. Similar thing. It wasn't towards someone in the audience. He was making fun of someone in the public eye, a singer, and I forget the details, but the singer has some type of disability, and they found the joke to be so offensive. He was sued, and he ended up, again, he was convicted, and he's supposed to pay $35,000 damages for a joke.
Yeah.
And so we're living in a time where, I mean, the only reason I think we haven't seen this in the United States yet is because we are unique in that we have a First Amendment. However, I do believe the people who believe what I used to believe, the people who are pushing that ideology in the name of safety and no harm and supposedly empathy, the ultimate end goal of that ideology is to codify that into law. I mean, they would be more than happy for us to have the same restrictions here. They would be happy to throw people in jail the way Lenny Bruce used to be thrown in jail. And
absolutely,
we can see that last year. This to me encapsulates everything. So last year, this tells you what's going on at college campuses, and then what's happening at college campuses is now leaking out into the mainstream. But Brandeis University banned a play about Lenny Bruce. Right. Brandeis, which also has a history of being it's named after a Supreme Court justice. It's all about free speech. They banned a Lenny Bruce. If you were to tell Lenny Bruce, hey, in the future it's going to be the left who's censoring you, I can't even imagine that somebody would believe that could become true. But that's where we're at now. It's it's too harmful. The themes of this play might offend some students. We have to protect them from it. So I think that's really crazy. Okay, but to get back to Owen Benjamin quickly. Yes, he is a comedian who was on the national stage. He was hosting award shows. I wasn't that familiar with him before, but he was on his way up to being a household name, most likely. And then
he has a couple of Amazon Prime specials and stuff out. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can find him now on hugepianist.com. He plays the piano, hugepianist.com. But you can't, I say that because he's still on YouTube and you can find him there, but pretty soon he's probably going to be kicked off. As you've noticed, they keep pushing the goalposts on who they're blocking from all the social media platforms. They just kicked Sargon of Akkad off, I think.
They kicked Sargon off of YouTube?
He's gone.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
They kicked they kicked Owen off of Twitter before they kicked Alex Jones off, like before it was cool. So
before it was cool.
Yeah, he was banned. And the reason he was banned, well, he refuses to live by these speech codes. And so a lot of comedians I used to know before they all started going through this change, this SJW change, it's like if you told a comedian that they couldn't say something, that something was off limits. And I had comedians I worked with who used to tell me this. It's like, as they're on stage, that's going through their head. Of course, they're going to say that. If the one way to get them to say something you don't want them to say is tell them they can't say it. And but now a lot of them seem to be operating with this SJW critic in their head who's telling them, no, don't say that. And they're like evaluating their jokes before they put it out into the world. And he refuses to do that. As far as I can tell, he's just doing what comics have always done, which is like, oh, you're telling me I can't say these words, and I'm going to say these words. And so he got kicked off of Twitter. He lost his agent at CAA. He lost his manager, all because he got into a Twitter spat with a guy in the comedy community who does a lot of podcasting. A lot of my clients used to be on his shows. And this guy has a son who's, I believe at the time, and again, this is just my memory, I should go back and look at it, but was 2 years old, 3 years old, who decided that he was a girl at 2. And he had started calling his child his daughter and dressing his child like a girl. And basically he did some interviews and stuff about his trans daughter. And Owen Benjamin got into a spat with him because he admitted that he was going to start putting his kid on hormone blockers soon, which hormone blockers can, among other things, they can potentially sterilize you. I mean, it's just to do that to a child when they don't have, I understand exactly why Owen was sort of like, hey, wait a minute, where are we going with this? And, but that's considered, that's transphobic. You can't question that anymore. You can't question if it's ethical or if it's moral or if it's in the child's best interest to medically or surgically intervene before they're 18 because of something they tell you that they believe they are. And so he lost all of his representation.
Yeah, you're just reminding me of something that I did. There was a little Twitter spat I saw the other day, which just blew my mind that this was the argument that I saw someone making. You're reminding me of it. They were saying, I think it was about someone who's like 8 or 9, and it was a similar, put them on hormones kind of discussion about this kid who felt like they identified as the opposite sex. And the argument was, well, the child has consented. So someone said, well, it's child abuse, blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, the child has consented. And it's really weird to me that we have this idea that an 8 or 9-year-old can consent. If you, I mean, I don't want to bring up anything gross, but I'm gonna. If you have consensual sex with a 10-year-old, that's rape. That's statutory rape. And it's rape because they can't consent. And we recognize in society that kids can't consent. So this idea that like a kid can consent to medical procedures like that is absolutely horrific. And it's clear that they don't care about the children at all. They just care about their agenda. And they love the idea that an 8-year-old would decide to transition. They have a fetish about this idea that 8-year-olds know what gender they want to be and they're going to transition and we should allow that. But really it is child abuse. They can't consent. They can't possibly have informed consent at that age. And I'm not against adults doing it, but it's really horrible.
Right. I mean, my position on that, not to get too far afield of comedy, but I actually have met, I've met some trans kids and parents of trans kids. And I can't imagine being in that position. First of all, I can't imagine being a parent. I'll just fess up. I'm not even responsible enough to be a parent.
Yes, you are. Yes,
not yet. But to be, I can't imagine being in that position, and I don't know what I would do. And I do think there's a difference between the small statistical percentage of kids who have identified, who have actual like gender dysphoria and who've dealt with this from a very young age. The literature shows, so 2 and 3 is not that unusual to have, especially male children saying that they're girls. What's different now is that the whole medical position in the medical community has changed in the past 5 or 6 years, the same way it has in comedy. Everything's changed. It's changing everywhere. This ideology is infiltrating everything. And so now, like the top doctors in the field who used to work with all these kids with gender dysphoria are now completely shunned and blacklisted, and even documentaries about them are banned in the US. You know, it's like, so the instead of like talking through this with kids with actual dysphoria, where they found that a large percentage of them ended up being okay with their biological sex and not wanting to transition, now that they just immediately are like, let's go this route. Let's validate what your kid is saying. Let's put your kid on drugs. You know, they don't offer any other way. It's a very closed-minded way of looking at it. And then on top of that, there's a difference between that very small percentage of kids and then this large group of kids that are now saying they're trans, which are being called trans trenders because it's in the news and because they're being forced to grapple with it. And there's suddenly, it's like, you know, this is a decision that kids never had to grapple with before, 99.9% of kids. And now you're like, you better decide, 4-year-old, like, are you trans or cis? Like, what? Like, it makes about as much sense as asking them if they're gay or straight at like 3. Do you know? It's like, they shouldn't have to make ridiculous. That. It's not a decision that most people have to make. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting
No, you're getting off topic. So I'm going to pull you back in.
Okay.
One of the things that started this show today, or that inspired this show today, was Konstantin Kissin's. He's a comedian. He was asked to sign an agreement. Keri, pull it up and tell us, because I know you've got it in front of you. He was going to perform, and they stuck an agreement in front of him before he got on stage.
Agreement. Now, and first of all, I had someone saying to me before this happened this week, we were talking about comedy, and I think we were talking about what happened to Nimesh Patel, which we can also get into. And one of my friends said, "Oh, pretty soon they're going to be asking comedians to sign agreements so they can look over their set and pull out everything that's problematic." And I was like, no, but dude, this has been happening for 10 years at least. I mean, I had this same kind of stuff happening with with LGBT whatever, IP plus. We had the same kind of stuff happening where you have comedians who are in support of the ideology, who are LGBT positive, who are then being asked by LGBT groups to submit their entire set so they can take out any problematic words or concepts. I was talking as a manager to colleges and to different interest groups, nonprofits and stuff with this about the same stuff. So this has been happening for a while. The difference is it was never so explicit. Like now it's gotten almost hilarious because it's in this little agreement. I'll read to you. This comedy night organized by blank society aims to provide
just
a safe...
set context. So this is an agreement that they gave a comedian and said, please sign this before you come on stage. So, okay.
Right. You can't perform until you sign this.
Right. So, okay, go.
Okay. We aim to provide a safe space for everyone to come together and share and listen to comedy. With also all proceeds donated to UNICEF. This is a chance to be entertained and overjoyed by the different performances here on this day, hence the importance of this contract. The contract has been written to ensure an environment where joy, love, and acceptance is reciprocated by all. By signing this contract, you are agreeing to our no tolerance policy with regards to racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, or anti-religion or anti-atheism. All topics must be presented in a way that is respectful and kind. It does not mean that these topics cannot be discussed, but it must be done in a respectful and non-abusive way. This comedian, again, you guys can find him on Twitter. His name is Konstantin Kissin, and I hadn't heard of him before this, but I saw his comedy bit about this, and it was hilarious. He ended up not signing this, of course, but a lot of people do because... you know, a lot of people, this, from what I understand, wasn't even a paid gig. That's even funnier. But if it's a paid gig and you want to be able to play, I can understand why some people are like, okay, I guess I'll go in there. But in the past, they wouldn't have. So one of the comics I was talking about, so I used to represent Margaret Cho. I had LGBT groups who were sending me, you know, we want to see her set ahead of time so we can take out anything that's problematic. Well, Margaret had the clout at the time for us to be able to say no. Like, well, then we're not going to do this show. Like that, and I even had to explain to them, and they wanted to talk to her personally and to go over. I'm like, no, you're not going to sit down with her on a conference call and pick out, you know, you can't say this or that. But she had the clout to be able for us to be able to say, no, we're not going to do the show and still get to do it. A lot of comedians, if they're just starting out or if they really need the money, it's like, you're putting them in a weird position where you're telling them not to do what their job is.
Right. Right. And it's and it really requires, you and I talked about this, but part of being a comedian is being able to kind of turn off that filter in your brain that, like, you'll have thoughts about things and you'll filter them out because, like, oh, that's inappropriate, or, oh, no, that's wrong, or whatever. But part of being a comedian is being able to experiment and kind of turn that off and, let yourself kind of free associate in some way. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you hit on things that are funny. And if you're a really good comedian, you can kind of free associate live on stage and interact with your audience. And sometimes what you might say is offensive, but it's usually, if you're good, it's usually also funny. And you're asking them to, like, embed that sensor back into their brain, which really destroys your ability to be creative and think generally. If you've got a constant, Jiminy Cricket in your head, like, don't say that. What about that? Could this be taken the wrong way? What, blah, blah, blah. I know you mean this, but what about that? And what if someone's offended? It really stifles creativity on a fundamental level, I think.
It's comedy by committee, which is not funny.
Right. No good art is done by committee.
No good art's done by committee. And it's just, it's so humorless. Like it has to have this stamp of approval. And so to bring us to Nimesh Patel, which also happened this week or the past week. So this guy gets hired like a lot of comics do. Okay, so this is something I used to do, by the way. Let me back up. So I was not really in the system. Like, I wasn't one of the boys club or whatever. I just wasn't like a standard entertainment industry person. Like I said, I got into it because I wanted to push my belief system, and I worked with comics who I felt like were, for the most part, dealing with these issues in their comedy. So racism, sexism, homophobia, combating all these things in an intersectional way. It sounds like so much fun, but so that's what I was doing.
Doesn't it?
And so I was really good at working with nonprofits. That's where I would partner my comedians with different social justice groups and organizations, and it's like a win-win for the comedian and the group. And so you have the comedian promoting the organization, you have the organization selling tickets for you and doing group buys and doing add-ons and VIP meet and greets and whatever. And then especially at colleges, you can get the LGBT group, and so a lot of times the entertainment budget at colleges is pretty small. But if you can get the entertainment budget and the women's studies funding and the Asian American group or the LGBT group or the Black Lives Matter group or whoever's on campus, you get all these SJW groups to come together and pool their money, and you can make a lot for if you're hitting on all these topics. And so you mentioned Jerry Seinfeld. He and Chris Rock a few years ago, that both of them said in separate interviews or something that they had quit doing colleges because they had become so PC. And the audiences were responding differently. And so it's not just the bureaucrats and these Orwellian sounding offices of diversity and inclusion. It's the students now. The students they don't want to hear anything that's upsetting. They demand these safe spaces and trigger warnings. And, it's the students who banned the Lenny Bruce play. And so this Nimesh Patel student group brought him in, like an Asian American racial diversity group or something, brought him in. He did a joke, which if you go and read it, it was SJW compliant. It wasn't even against the ideology. His joke was about intersectionality and intersectional oppressions. And he basically, he's an Indian guy. He made a joke about how the reason why you can tell that being Black and gay is not a choice is because who goes through life as a Black person, like facing racism, and then says, let's add some homophobia on top of that, right? Like that, right. His whole joke is that it's about racism and homophobia and multiple intersections. It's that whole SJW kit and caboodle. And they didn't like it, and they yanked him off stage. And so
they actually took him off stage, just like yelled later.
Yeah. And so I think it's progressed even past where it was 5 years ago, because now that kind of joke 5 years ago would have been applauded. Oh, he's so smart and brilliant, and he's teaching us about intersectionality through his comedy. But now there's this idea, it's gone even further, where this whole collectivism idea, you're not allowed to speak for anyone that doesn't, or even to speak about anyone that doesn't look exactly like you. And so if he had been a Black gay comedian, it would have been fine. But because he's a straight Indian guy, They're like, stay in your lane. That's what they mean by stay in your lane. You're not allowed to speak to this joke. You know, it's because of the different oppressions and whatever. Like you're not on the same level. You can't make this joke. That's ridiculous. And it's the students who yanked him.
So this is good because I want to get into the culture and the philosophy behind this, because like you said, it's not that there are just a few authoritarians at the top with some rules and they're the problem. It's a cultural problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did a little bit of looking up, because I kind of, you know, I'm sure a lot of people have thought of this before, but like, gee, what makes something funny? What is comedy? And you know, there's not consensus. There's a few theories, but I want to talk about two that I ran across, because oddly, one of them was very kind of mainstream. It was from Social Psych Online, and it talks about this theory developed by a guy named Peter McGraw. And his theory of the psychology of humor is basically things are funny when two conditions are met. One, they violate the way we think about how the world should work, the way we think the world should work. And two, it does that in a way that's non-threatening, right? So this is kind of the theory. And so they say, like, the first part, you know, if you talk about violation, it's like, oh, this is how we, you know, there's norms for appropriate behavior and beliefs about how things work. And when you violate them, you know, that's one criteria. But of course, you can violate them by, like, being a terrorist, and that's not funny. So it has to also be a benign, what they're calling a benign violation, like something that doesn't really matter in the scheme of things. And I thought this was really interesting because it's a kind of less philosophical version of humor that I'll admit, I often go look at what Ayn Rand said about stuff. I don't always think she's correct or complete about a subject. And humor is a subject I don't think she treated like, I don't think she really completed any. I think she could have done a lot more work if she cared. So I don't think she's the Bible on humor, but she had a very interesting, her description was, and I really like her description just philosophically. She says, humor is the denial of metaphysical importance to that which you laugh at, which is kind of the same thing as what Peter McGraw is saying. So she says, like, the classic example here is you see a very snooty, very well-dressed dowager walking down the street, and then she slips on a banana peel. What's funny about it? It's the contrast of the woman's pretensions to reality, right? She acted very grand, but in reality undercut her with something as plain as a banana peel, right? And that's the denial of the metaphysical validity or importance of the pretensions of that woman. And humor is fundamentally, she said, humor is fundamentally a destructive element, right? And I think that actually ties well with this this Peter McGraw formulation of it's destructive in that it's violating something, but it's got to be benign, right? It's got to be this benign violation. And if we think about humor in that way, I think at least for me, it was easier to see why SJWs were getting so upset about some of the humor that we've seen them get so upset about. And so, like, let's just take the PewDiePie or Count Dankula, like, examples, right? Okay, well, both of them are making fun of Nazis, right? Like, they're both, it's kind of like funny Nazi thing, right? And both of them, you could say, they're denying the metaphysical importance of Nazism, right? And they're violating the way that we think the world should work. Like, cute little pugs shouldn't be Nazis, right? But it's benign, right? It's a stupid pug doing it's a benign thing. He's not actually gassing people and, like, invading France. He's a pug, you know, reflexively raising a paw. And it's this mixture of kind of like violating what we think is right and doing it in a benign way. But to SJWs, there is nothing benign.
Yes.
And so, like, it's the same kind of, like, it's the same mentality, right? That's like, oh, you're a guy and your knees are too far apart on the bus. You're manspreading. that's not like, that's a microaggression.
Yes.
Nothing is benign. There is no like,
because
just hanging out with your legs open, right?
You're so right, because they view the whole world through this lens, this ideological lens. It's like they put on their oppression glasses and everything is viewed through these glasses. Is like they can't see. You're so right. I hadn't thought of it that way, but there's nothing benign. There's always racism or sexism to be found in it. Like if you're looking, especially the ones who make a living off of it, they have to find it everywhere. You know, their weekly columns depend on it or whatever. Like it's, yeah, that's really funny.
Right? So and they're very, you know, oppressions to them, like victimization and oppression, they're critically important things, right? Mm-hmm. And I think to normal people who have more of like a benevolent universe perspective, right? Victimization and oppression are things that like can happen, but they don't ultimately matter like on a day-to-day basis. They don't matter to most of us because most of us aren't fundamentally victims, right? Like a normal person doesn't fundamentally think that they're mostly a victim and that everyone around them is like, there's like massive victimization and oppression happening all the time. And it's critically important. A normal person's like, yeah, sometimes people are jerks to other people and there's a little bit of oppression, but it's really not, it's not so crucial and critical. Right. But yeah, by the way, I agree. Tim just said he's got to be honest. Of all the names he did not expect to hear in a discussion of what's funny, Ayn Rand will be at the top of his list. I do agree with Tim. I just reflexively looked up what she said about humor, and I was like, oh, actually, that actually is an interesting formulation. She said some other stuff that I didn't agree with, but
this is the first time I've been able to see the chat. Look at this.
See, there you go.
So someone corrected us. It wasn't Sargon didn't get kicked off YouTube yet. He was kicked off of Patreon.
Right. So I want to talk about. I actually wanted to. I'm going to tell two horrible jokes that I don't think are appropriate.
Okay.
But I want to do it because you.
Can we put a big graphic in that says trigger warning? I'm kidding.
Yeah, I should. I should have prepared a trigger warning graphic to splash across the screen. But the reason I want to talk about this is, you know, as I started to think about this formulation of like denying metaphysical importance or like violation of your concepts in a benign way, it really tied in with how I have a daughter, and obviously I was a kid once. We were all kids once, and kids tend to, I watch kids like how they experiment with jokes, right? And it's very clear that as a kid, you get that the violation is an aspect of it, right? It's why kids think like fart jokes or just saying like the word poop or something is like, oh, that's, ooh, we're not supposed to say it. It's taboo. They get that violation of norms is part of a joke. But what kids don't necessarily understand is what's benign and what's not benign. And so often with younger kids, you'll run into them making jokes where it's the parent's job to say, whoa, actually, like that's not okay, right? And I thought of two examples from my own childhood. When I grew up, and I'm, a few years old. I grew up in the 80s, and the Challenger explosion happened. And there was a woman, the celebrity. She was a teacher, and she was, I think, going to be the first civilian in space. She was going to go up and do these lessons. And so everyone in school was watching to see this teacher go up to space. And of course, the Challenger blew up and she died. And after that, I remember there was a joke going around. And I remember sitting in the backseat of a car and someone telling this joke. And I remember a parent saying that it was inappropriate. And the joke was, what color are Krista McAuliffe's eyes? And the punchline was blue. One blew this way and one blew that way. And there was a couple kids in the back, and they were like, hee 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 hee. And the parent was like, that's not appropriate, right? It's not appropriate. She's like, first of all, this like happened recently. And there's like still an open wound. Wait, this is the whole concept of like, it's too soon, right? And second, it's not funny to make some fun of like someone's death. Like that's not funny, right? Like she was not a bad person. Not like you're making fun of Hitler's death, right? She's a good person, presumably, and she's like family and friends, and it's still very open wound, and like you don't that's inappropriate. But kids got that it was like they knew that it was a violation of something, which is why it was like, oh, it's going against something, so that maybe that's funny, and they would kind of say it and giggle. But then, you know, it's the parents' job to kind of correct and say, oh, that's not benign, right? And another example was I remember this joke when I was young as well, and I also remember that getting corrected by a parent. And what was the joke? It was so at the time Ethiopia was very was like the example of a nation with lots of starving people in it. Where people were very the Ethiopians were on the news all the time, and it was a big deal. And there was a joke about like, what do you call an Ethiopian with a sesame seed on his head, right? And kids would say a quarter pounder, and like that was like a funny thing because they were so like slight and dying. And again, this is like elementary school level kids who are like, they understand that there's like something that's taboo about that, and there's a violation. But again, a parent overheard that joke. I remember this as well. I was at a table at a friend's house, and the parent overheard that joke, and it's like, you can't, like, no, like that's not funny. It's not appropriate to make fun of people starving. Like, that's a tragedy. It's a sad thing. You don't make fun of people starving like that, and blah, blah, blah. And so the reason I'm telling these two, jokes is that I realize that part of a parent's responsibility is really helping a child figure out like what's benign and what's not benign.
Mm-hmm.
And SJWs, because they are such control freaks, I mean, at their fundamental core, SJWs are authoritarians, which means they want to be your authoritarian parent over everything. And they are basically just telling you nothing is benign. Nothing in these categories are benign, right?
Yeah.
And that's why, that's why they're a lot of comedians are feeling like really oppressed here and censored, because things that actually are benign for normal people are not benign, and there are some things that aren't benign, and it's not. That's why we have things like it's too soon to tell a joke about X, Y, or Z subject, right? Because it's not benign; it's still kind of relevant. So anyway, I don't know what you think of that, but that was kind of my thought process about like this kind of combination of violation of reality, or expectations plus benign, and how that relates to SJWs.
No,
what do you think, Keri?
I agree. Well, I think your sense of humor changes also with age and with wisdom, and with kids, it's obviously going to be more, scatological, or just, slapstick, or just really offensive, like you said, because they're trying to figure out what is benign, what's not. And they're looking to parents, or they're looking to adults for guidance. Sometimes like they're testing the boundaries, just like they do with everything, like kids do. But even as adults, I mean, that's what comedians do, is they test the boundaries. They, when you say he went there, or they go there, it's like they sometimes, it's funny because they're saying what you may be thinking, or maybe haven't thought, but it makes sense once you hear it vocalized, and you're laughing because it's so taboo. I mean, a lot of times they're voicing the taboo, they're pushing, they're transgressing in a way. And so you are right, though, I believe in that SJWs don't have a sense of humor, because they don't see anything as benign. And I would say that SJW humor has become more of like moralizing and preaching. This is why on all the late night shows, I think it was Morgan Murphy who first called it clapter. Maybe I'm wrong, but they're not laughing as much as they are clapping. It's almost like they're hearing a sermon. They're at church, and this has become the norm on the shows. I mean, a little bit more about my personal background. We may differ on this in terms of how things change, because I'm coming from my own personal experience, having like where I would say the late night shows have always leaned liberal, have always leaned left, but they weren't explicitly SJW until the past few years, in my opinion.
I don't think SJW is left, by the way, but that's a separate topic.
That's a separate thing.
I think we should stop calling them liberal, because they are not liberal.
Well, they're not liberal, but they are on the left, I would say. They're not liberal, though.
Not there.
We agree that they're not liberal. But so the SJW, so I executive produced and had a client who was a host of what I consider to be one of the first SJW late night shows, called Totally Biased on FX a few years ago. And at the time this was before my waking up or what have you. And I was so proud of it because I felt like, now on national TV, we're changing minds, but it was so, in retrospect, I understand now a lot of the criticism about the show and that it was just preachy. I mean, we had segments about where we brought on people who were heroes to me. Like, I never really cared about celebrities so much, but I looked up to like these different like feminist leaders or people like third wave feminists. And so like Lindy West, who writes for I think she writes for the Guardian and stuff now. And she writes a lot about what we talked about last week about, she writes a lot about weightism and fat phobia and all that stuff, and sexism. And she's one of these people I would say is a professional SJW. And I was so excited because we had her on and we were debating whether or not you can tell jokes about rape. We had her on with Jim Norton and they were debating. And at the time, of course, I'm squarely in her camp. And now I look back on it and I'm like, there is so much nuance around it. Back then it was like, well, I was kind of thinking, well, you're not like the people who yanked Nimesh Patel off stage. I'm like, well, if you're a man, you probably shouldn't even talk about rape. Of course you can make a joke about rape. It doesn't, your biological...
Men get raped more than women, but we don't talk about that because it's in prison, but that's a separate issue.
Well, that's a great point. And there's nothing about your race or your biological sex or your experience that makes a topic off limits. It just doesn't. And that's the authoritarian nature of the ideology. Like you said, they want to control who can say what. The best way to control people is to control language. This is why they redefine words that we've talked about before. They make up new words. They have an entirely new lexicon. And then they try and control what you can or can't say based on what you look like, what groups you belong to. It's ridiculous. And so, but anyway, after that show, I started seeing a lot of, so like in the entertainment industry, they do things in like trends. And so for a while, I don't know if you noticed, it's like everybody's buying like Anthony Bourdain style shows where there's like someone out on the road, and I ended up selling a show like that. But where someone's out on the road and it's like Anthony Bourdain, except it's a comedian or it's whatever. And then all of a sudden they're not. Then it's like no more Anthony Bourdain pitches. But for a while, that's what everyone's hearing, all the different networks, right? And so after that show, I feel like there was that movement for a while where it's like, okay, now everybody pitched their SJW comedy shows. And so I had a pilot that we sold to another network that was explicitly SJW. It was in competition against a lot of other SJW comedy pilots. It became the norm, kind of. I saw comedians who I had never seen doing that kind of comedy before suddenly doing that kind of comedy, and it's like, why are you doing this? Is it to get the TV show? Is it because you are now a believer and that you caught it? Because sometimes, maybe you caught it and you're a true believer now. But to see people like Jim Jeffries like suddenly being woke, or even Moshe Kasher is hilarious, but I was like, what is this problematic thing? Like, why that word is, I just hate that word now so much. Anyway, but suddenly just the trend was like, okay, SJW. And then you see like Samantha Bee, who's hilarious. And now she's not funny anymore. And the only thing
she hasn't been funny for a while.
I used to think she was so funny though. And now it seems like the only things you can make fun of that they're totally cool with, of course, are Trump bashing. I mean, any kind of Trump bashing joke.
Orange man
and
bad.
You can also, they also, just like they do in other ways, they now like very boldly and nakedly break their own rules if it's in the service of attacking someone who doesn't subscribe to their ideology. So that's why you see Samantha Bee calling Ivanka Trump a cunt, because normally that wouldn't be allowed. And actually, like I remember one of my comics was criticized, a feminist comic was criticized maybe 2010 or 9 or something, not that long ago, for calling Sarah Palin that word. And I ended up taking that joke out of her special before it was released because I was such a believer, and I was like, no, we can't. It's, and you can't call someone, it doesn't matter if they're on the right. Well, now it does. Now they don't. It's like the feminists and the SJWs have totally discarded that. They're complete hypocrites now. Oh yes, we can call someone these words that we wouldn't. We can make fun of Sarah Huckabee Sanders' looks because she's on the right. We can make fun of Laura Loomer in the way she looks because she's on the right. Like, they break all of their own rules. I'm on another rant. Sorry.
No, it's good. I agree with you. And I Tim in the chat actually said he misses the days when a joke could just bomb and that would be the end of it. And I think I agree with him, and actually, it reminds me of something that you and I talked about, I think yesterday, which was, you know, in my younger, 20 years ago, over maybe 25 years ago now, I was very conservative, because I grew up in a very conservative household, and I remember going to comedian or comic shows and going to see comedians once in a while, or seeing them on television. And I remember being offended sometimes at like 30%, 50% of what they were saying. Like I was just like, oh, I can't believe they would say that. It's very offensive, right? But I would go anyway because the other half of the stuff they were saying was hilarious, and that's fine. Like I didn't have to like everything that they said, and I could be offended, but it wasn't like, oh, I don't think, it wasn't like, oh, they should be deplatformed, right? Even back then when I was, I would say, very kind of religious right at the time, even then I wasn't like, oh, they should be deplatformed because they said things that I'm offended by. That going to a comedy show, part of going to a comedy show used to be, at least for me, and I think this is true for a lot of people, part of going to a comedy show used to be like this acknowledgement that like, okay, some stuff I might get offended at some stuff, but I'm gonna like loosen up and have a good time and trying to just like let go. If I'm offended by something, I'm just gonna like let it go and move to the next joke and like try and roll with it, because this is about fun and it's about making me laugh. And you know what? Sometimes they're gonna step in something I don't like, or they're gonna tell a joke that bombs, or they're going to say something that offends my religious sensibilities. And like, okay. But we're not. And I think that's what kind of Tim is referring to, where he's just like, oh, you try a joke. It didn't work. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe there's, it's an audience full of Mormons and you cracked a joke about Joseph Smith or whatever it was. Like, okay, it doesn't work. You move on. It's not the end of the world. But now it's like the audience has this expectation that you must not ever misstep. And I don't think you can be a comedian without being willing to misstep. You got to be willing to bomb and screw up in order to get to the good stuff. And that's how you get better.
That's with anything in life, not just comedy. It's like you have to be willing and able to fail multiple times in order to succeed, because you have to take those risks. And of course you have to do that in comedy. And this whole thing about like Kevin Hart apologizing, and I made a list because I just off the top of my head, I was trying to think about when this started and how many comedians started doing this, and the apology tours they go on. It's like, at first Kevin Hart didn't apologize. He did an Instagram video of like, those comments are like 8 years ago. I've addressed them multiple times, like move on. But then he ended up.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think comedians should ever apologize if they said something that was supposed to be funny.
Exactly. Unless here's my caveat to that. We've all been wrong before and we've changed our opinions. I mean, I'm a walking example of that. I changed my entire worldview. It took a while, but it's still evolving. But I can look back and say, oh, I regret having said such and such. But here, don't apologize unless it's true. Like, don't do an apology to appease a mob. Don't do a fake apology. That's what kills me. It's like all these people doing fake apologies because it's to save their career, or because their agent told them to, or their manager told them to, or it's fake. It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, but again, even so, I would say you still shouldn't apologize. If you were a comedian and you were saying something with the intent to make people laugh, then I don't think that you should apologize, even if you think later that was inappropriate. It's like, yeah, I wouldn't make that joke now, but I'm not sorry because my intent wasn't bad. I was just trying to make people laugh, and within the context of my knowledge at the time, that was an honest, good-natured attempt to make people laugh. Okay.
For the most part, I think I agree with you. I just want to leave some room there because I do believe in like a really sincere apology. For the most part, I agree with you though. If your intent was not bad, like that's the thing they say. SJW say intent doesn't matter. So if you say, oh, if they're like, hey, you offended me, and you say, well, I didn't mean to, and they're like, intent doesn't matter. Like intent.
Offense doesn't matter either. That's the dirty little secret. But
and so again, this is that external thing. They're putting the responsibility for their feelings, their emotions on an outside person. Like you caused them harm. They hate apology. SJWs don't like it. They consider the if you say I'm sorry, you feel bad. They're like, it's not about how I feel. It's about what you did. Like you have to say, I'm sorry, I did this that made you feel bad.
Right.
I don't abide by that anymore. It's like everybody's responsible for their own feelings and emotions, and You know, if I do apologize now, it's like, I'm sorry you feel that way, but if I did something wrong, I definitely want to make this difference of opinion with you, Carter, because I do believe in the power of being like an honest apology. What I think is that these things are not honest, and that's what really bothers me about them. It's just the force of the mob. They're like, this is what'll stop the mob. And as we know, don't apologize to a mob. It never works. It never appeases them. No, then they just go for more scalps. And they basically say, like, if you apologize, then they're like, see, we were right. You are racist, or you are a homophobe.
Right. Well, look, I mean, there's probably some exceptions to what I was saying, but, you know, as with anything, not just comedy, and especially when we do live shows like this, I think it's important to be able to kind of work out your thought process and just say things and like, yeah, I said no comic should ever apologize. There's probably exceptions, but in general, that's true. Like, in general, that's true. You could probably come up with some weird exception where, you know, they should apologize because they were Nazis. Nazis would probably be involved.
You're going to be apologizing for this next week. I'm joking.
But I'm not. But that's the thing. There's a difference between saying I wouldn't make that joke now because my worldview has changed, and saying I'm sorry that I made it at the time. Because jokes, you know, unless jokes shouldn't be doing real damage. I guess the exception I could see was with, like, if you were telling jokes that were like somehow, I'm not sure exactly how, but like somehow enabling like real damage to be done in some major way, then I could see like, oh, I apologize because I was like enabling this. But if it was just like some people got offended, it's like, yeah, I guess I wouldn't make that joke now. Sorry for my old beliefs, but I'm not like sorry for being myself at the time. Like, okay.
Well, that's at the heart of their belief system too. Is they believe, and they say one of their slogans is words are violence. Like, words are harmful. They have, and so they view this as equivalent with, if you make a joke that offends someone, it's the equivalent of punching them. Really? No, it's not. It's, why can't we get back to, it seems so simple, but we used to teach kids sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And now it's like, words are so harmful. Let's create fallout shelters for.
Right. But sticks and stones are just free speech if you're Antifa.
Right.
So look, we're getting close to the end, and there's a couple things I want to bring up because you really liked these two things when I talked about them before. Actually, maybe I only talked about one. Social justice warriors are authoritarians. They are not liberals. They are authoritarians, and I think there's less difference between SJWs and Nazis than I mean, other than the swastika and a few other things, and there's not a lot of difference between SJWs and Nazis in the kind of fundamental sense of how they view the world, which is they believe that they have the right answers and they should use force to create the world in their image, in the image that they want, and everyone else's freedoms be damned. And just to give you some examples of how humor is dealt with, in the Nazi regime in 1934, they passed the malicious gossip law, in which telling an anti-Nazi joke was a crime, leading to fine or imprisonment. That's how it goes. That's humor is something that authoritarian regimes go after. Another example.
By the way, can I interrupt real quick? Telling an anti-Nazi joke got you imprisoned. Was that it? So this is really funny because
Count Dankula, it's the same.
It's the same, and actually, if you think about it, his joke, it doesn't even make any sense what they were prosecuting him for, because he said, I turned the dog into the worst thing I can imagine, which is a Nazi. That's anti-Nazi. And you're comparing a dog to Hitler. You're comparing Hitler to a dog. That's an anti-Nazi joke.
It was totally anti-Nazi. I mean, in fact, that was the point, because pugs are recognized as super cute, right? Yeah. So it was like, I'm going to take this super cute thing and inject him with the most evil behavior I could think of. Right. So Jason brings up the USSR, which was my next one. He says he thinks it was a clown who was one of the first dissidents to be executed by Lenin's secret police. I didn't know that, but that's probably true. But I do have some information from Yakov Smirnov, kind of famous Soviet comic. He's done interviews about this, and he says there was joke approval in the Soviet Union. So in all seriousness, there was a department of jokes. Let's see. I swear to God, there's the Ministry of Culture, and they had a department of jokes.
It's like the Ministry of Truth from Brave New World.
Yes,
Ministry
exactly, right? And by the way, so the SJWs like to call Nazi Germany a thing on the right, which I think you can argue whether fascism was on the right or left, but it doesn't matter. The USSR is squarely in the commie camp. So let's take an example of socialism taken to its extreme, which is the Soviet Union. So here we go. There was this Ministry of Culture, the Department of Jokes, and you were required to submit your material to the Department of Jokes. And he says, let's see, they had a very big Department of Humor, he says. Once a year, they censor your material, and then you have to stay with what you have approved. So you would send in your stuff, right? And every year they would like give you your approved, like these are the things, and you can't improvise. So you write out your material, you mail it to them, and they send it back to you with corrections. And after that, you have to stay with it for a year. You can't improvise or whatever. Like that's your material. And then after a year, you can like submit updated material. So
this is what that group wanted. They hired Nimesh Patel. They wanted a puppet. They should just institute the same. They should get this agreement form. Flesh it out.
Absolutely. So this is the mentality, and it's not just about a few ruling elites that are passing these rules. This is the culture that's evolved, not just on college campuses. I think probably Silicon Valley generally, where I live, is a great example of a lot of that culture leaking into mainstream. But we've got this culture where people believe that the jokes should be approved, and you can't ever, if you ever make a misstep, right, one misstep or one offensive thing, and that's it for you. And it really does reek of Nazi Germany and the Stalin Russia, right, the Soviet Union. I don't really think there's one of the things that makes, you mentioned it earlier, one of the things that makes America unique is we do have the freedom of speech. And not just do we have the freedom of speech codified, but we had a culture where it was okay to be an offensive asshole on stage to a lot of people. And if your joke bombed, so what? You moved on. There was this acceptance that you could say what you want, and some people were going to disagree with other people. And there's exceptions. I mean, you mentioned Lenny Bruce, and there's obscenity laws and that kind of thing that people have been prosecuted for. But culturally, there has been this acceptance that you should have the freedom to do this stuff, and that is disappearing. And it's disappearing because we've got social justice authoritarian ideology has kind of taken over. At least colleges and
it's
possibly,
seeping.
It's
seeping into the mainstream. That's why you see it now affecting people like Kevin Hart. I mean, how much more mainstream can you get? And the Oscars. I think it was Owen Benjamin said, he was talking about he did a song or something. He was talking about Martin Luther King. He was doing a version of Martin Luther King's speech of like, I have a dream that one day a black man can make jokes about gay people and still host the Oscars like a white man could if he made, because like Jimmy Kimmel's made gay, he's hosted the Oscars twice, you know what I mean, like the double standard. I thought that was funny. But he said, and still host an award show that's just meant to honor a bunch of demons. Which is kind of what the entertainment industry, you're fighting to present to this very, I've always hated award shows. So
wait, let's see if I can share this. You wanted me to share a video. Let's see if I can. I'm going to try and share this. I don't know if it'll work. Before you share the
video, you play around with it. Can I say one thing before I forget?
Yeah. Do your thing.
So a friend, we were talking about the Nimesh thing a few days ago, and a friend asked me a question, which I thought it was a very good question. See, sometimes when somebody asks you something and you're immediately like, you're wrong. And then if you take a step back and you think about what they're asking you, you can actually, or at least I can sometimes figure out, they're helping me think through this more, because I do initially like my guts to disagree with them, but then it's like, how do I answer that question? And so this friend was saying, how is this like the agreement form that we talked about that Konstantin Kisin posted, where you agreeing not to do any of this type of comedy? He's like, how's that any different than like a Christian group on campus hiring a Christian comedian and asking you not to swear or to say certain other things, right? And so I thought about it, and I think there are two important distinctions, and maybe you can tell me if these sound right or if I'm off base or if you
I
can
don't know.
think
This
of
is a
others.
great question. So I'm curious what your conclusion is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I think my conclusion is that one, this is happening. Well, okay. One, that it's not just one group on one college campus, that this is the norm. This is happening on almost all college campuses now. And like I said, it's seeped into the mainstream. You don't see Christianity having that kind of mainstream influence. Like I said, I could rattle off a list of comics who've apologized because they've offended the Church of SJW. It's like Sarah Silverman, Bill Maher, Tracy Morgan, Roseanne Barr, Norm Macdonald even apologized recently. Tracy Morgan 2011 was in the same situation Kevin Hart's in now in terms of having to apologize for homophobic jokes. But I don't see mainstream comedians out there on an apology tour because they offended Christians. It's just so one big difference is the influence and the fact that this has become a mainstream belief system. Another big difference I would say is that the people who subscribe to SJW ideology, they don't realize they're subscribing to a belief system. They'll actually argue with me, no, it's not a belief system. This is the way the world is. This is the way the world is. I'm like, no, that's the way you believe it is. You are a part of a religion, whether you realize it or not. And it, at least Christians realize this is my belief system. This is my religion. They're cognizant of it. People who subscribe to SJW ideology, I think they're just like, this is the way the world is. And you guys are all idiots if you don't get it. And then the third difference, I thought, oh gosh, what was the third one? Because the third one was a big one. It'll come back to me. But yeah, I guess the biggest one was just that you don't see it everywhere. It's not infiltrating everything. And you don't see people bowing to like Christianity and making apologies for it the way it's just not the same thing. It's not on the same massive scale.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would agree with you. And I think, as an atheist, I recognize that there will be certain groups who have. So first of all, it's not a general comedy thing. This is a Christian comedy thing. There's going to be some groups that have their standards, and Christians. If there's like a Muslim comedy show, you probably can't draw pictures of Allah and make fun of him, or sorry, Muhammad, and make fun of him. So like I get that there's a set of rules associated with this belief system, but it's this group, right, that is declaring that it's not a comedy show, it's a Christian comedy show. That's a different thing. And I would argue if that was widespread, kind of like you, if there were Christians, if comedy shows on every campus everywhere, whether or not they had the Christian label, have been taken over by Christians saying you couldn't swear and you can't do this, and I would be fighting the same battle against those Christians and saying like, no. Like you're allowed, and actually, if SJWs want to have SJW comedy night, fine, like do that. But it's the fact that they are, A, in mainstream, and B, trying to foist their ideology upon the mainstream. I would also oppose a Christian group that was saying like, well, these are our standards for Christian comedy, and they should be everyone's standards. Those should be the mainstream standards, and we're going to fight to make those the mainstream standards. I would be opposed to that as well. So, if a group, any group, social justice warriors or whoever, want to have, want to get together and say, this is our group, our standards are different from the mainstream. We're not implying that everyone should have to agree with us and that these necessarily need to be implemented in the mainstream, but we like our little safe space for our little SJW jokes, and we're going to have an SJW comedy night. And to do that, you got to sign a freaking form. Like, I don't care. That's fine.
Exactly. If it was its own thing and it's said, but instead it's the overall attitude. They have entire offices and staff and these friggin', they're not academics, they're administrators and bureaucrats that they're paying these exorbitant salaries on campus to push this religion. It is a religion. That made me think of the other difference I thought of, which is this comedy show is not happening at a church. It's happening on a college campus, which used to symbolize a place of free inquiry and free speech. And, the birth of the free speech movement, it was in Berkeley. And now Berkeley is one of the most restrictive in terms of speech. And so that's just really sad to me that you're seeing this kind of all these, and you can't do that. And that whole list that they had in the agreement, they're not billing it as this is our little insular religion comedy show. They're billing it as this is the way we all believe now in the world. And like you said, they're trying to enforce it. They're trying to put it on people. I was so blessed to meet a really great group of Christians this past year who through the civility dinners. And I remember at one of our dinners, we were talking about, I can't remember what we were talking about, but the topic of gay marriage came up. And this one guy, this friend who's an evangelical, was saying, well, we don't really, there's God's law and there's man's law. It was sort of like live and let live. Like, we're not going to come and try and to influence the man. We're just going to, we want to be able to believe what we want to believe, but we're not going to come out and protest against, whatever. And that was so new to me because I'd always had the stereotype in my mind of like the type of Christian who's like the Westboro Baptist Church type of Christian.
Right.
And so that they're not enforcing. It's not like if you have a Christian comedy show on campus, it's not like we want to subject everyone to the rules that we're going to have at our event. So that's a difference anyway.
Right. And we're not, yeah. And you're not like, if you're a Christian comedy club doesn't go and yell at a comedian who performed somewhere else for a joke that didn't meet their standards.
Right.
Right. It's like, that's not a thing. Right. But I think one thing that, makes Western culture, special is, and you can have arguments about where this came from, whether it came from, Christian ideology. Obviously the Enlightenment was a big part of it, but there's this idea that like there is, and I know that separation of church and state actually isn't in the Constitution, but it is a precedent, and it is a cultural, it's an idea that's pervasive in Western culture. And prior to that, the church and state weren't really separate, and so any moral laws that you had, any kind of moral set of standards were implemented by the government and enforced using the force of the government. And one thing that makes America special, and not just America, there's other countries that have this, but one thing that made America special, originally and still makes America special is like, okay, there is this disconnect. I cannot believe, you can believe in Christianity. Someone else can be a Jew. Someone else can be a Muslim. Someone else can be a Zoroastrian. And none of us get to force the others to adhere to our moral standards. There's instead this separate set of standards based on natural law about us having individual rights and needing to not murder and steal and leave each other alone. Mm-hmm. And like, okay, we don't hit people, we don't steal their stuff, but we also can't force people to pray in a certain way or use certain words, or like we're leaving that kind of messy reality out there. And it means that I will disagree with lots of people about the way they live their lives and the words they use and the things they do and say to people. But that's okay. I'm allowed to disagree. I don't need to shoot them for it and send them to jail, which is ultimately what wielding government power is. Mm-hmm. Anyway, you wanted me to play this video. I don't know if this will work, but it's a great video, so I'm going to try it.
Okay, I see it now.
For those of you who were just listening, that just sounded weird, I'm sure. But
well, there was no sound, at least on my end. There was no sound.
Oh, there's no sound? Okay, so no one can hear it anyway.
So people can go. It's got a really funny music with it. But I was just talking about that with Carter. That the YouTuber, his name is Some Black Guy. I think he also goes by Derek Blackman on Facebook. But on YouTube, he's Some Black Guy. And he just did this really short video back when the It's Okay to Be White meme was happening. And it cracked me up so much. And I was telling Carter a few years ago when I started sort of undergoing this transformation, like leaving the SJW ideology behind, I started to realize, man, it's like at the same time that all these mainstream comics or people that you see on television and in the clubs and stuff, at the same time that they were becoming more cowardly and more like groupthink and all saying the same beliefs on stage for claps, I started to see this really unruly kind of humor on YouTube where these younger kids who were just kind of thumbing their nose at these, which is what comedy is supposed to do, thumbing their nose at the status quo, at the taboos, at the things they're not allowed to say. And really the only things like, gosh, man, the only things making me laugh these days are these YouTubers. So
yeah, no, I mean, for those who didn't see that video, just to describe it, it's like a black guy kind of going about his day, dum-dum, walks up to this door and there's a sign that says, it's okay to be white. And he like feigns a heart attack and like falls over in depression that it like, oh my God. Because
at that time in the news, they were saying, I think it was some 4chan meme or something where they started putting up all these signs just to troll, just to get SJWs to freak out and write a lot of opinion pieces about how it's okay to be white is white supremacy. Like it's not okay to be white. And so they was like, oh, it's harmful. And there were colleges that were saying, we got to take down these harmful signs. So he's like making fun of that. It was really funny.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And to kind of underscore what you were just talking about, kind of the younger kids kind of being counterculture and being the funny ones making these videos. Keith reminded us that on the chat that one of the things that the role that the court jester played in the past was he was the only one that could really get away with speaking the truth to the king. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what comedy can do. And I think nowadays it is the younger kids, and you and I talked about this also. For the older generations, maybe joking about Nazis is too serious, right? Because they lived through it, and or at least they have parents or grandparents who lived through it. But I think what we're seeing for these younger generations, like PewDiePie and the younger kids, Nazis, I think you used the term like they're just kind of cartoonish. It's like this weird, like stupid thing. Like who would ever be a Nazi? What a dumb ideology. Mm-hmm. And like, yes, it's evil and destructive, but like how stupid, and they wore stupid outfits and they said stupid things, and like it's almost unbelievable. And so to them, they can kind of joke and be like, haha, like I'm gonna, PewDiePie, one of his responses to being saying that, yes, I guess someone blamed him for saying some Nazi stuff or whatever, is one of his responses at the end of this video is like, it looked like he kind of pretended to like leave the camera on by mistake and like put on like a German uniform and like watched a Hitler video for a minute. And like, he's like, they just think it's funny. And I think, I don't think there's anything wrong with them thinking it's funny. I mean, kids just didn't, I mentioned this before, but my wife is from China, and, we watched this show, Man in the High Castle, and like, she thinks it's like funny to say, like, she thinks some of the Nazi words are funny and some of the things that they do are funny. And sometimes she'll say things and I'll be like, you can't joke about that. Like, oh, we're in the Bay Area. Like, it's Nazis. You can't joke about it. And she's like, well, it's Nazis. I don't know. Like, for her, like Nazis are not it wasn't part of the culture. And, the Japanese, we can't joke about that because they invaded China a lot. And that that was more sensitive to her.
Yeah.
Right. But Nazis, they were just kind of this funny, stupid thing. So,
well, and what better way to subvert a dangerous ideology than to make it a punchline? I mean, that's what they're doing.
Sure.
They're making fun of it. They're making Hitler into a laugh line. He's the punchline. I would argue now, the reason why they're so funny is because SJW ideology has become mainstream. I mean, you've got comedians now talking about implicit bias. You have Clinton mentioned implicit bias in a speech. You've got all these concepts that used to be in the classroom, or now that people are preaching them in the mainstream. And so anyway, that's the status quo. That's the king. And so they are poking fun at the king. And this is why I don't necessarily disagree with SJWs about the punching up thing, but making fun of SJW ideology is punching up. It is.
Yeah. I mean, I disagree with him about the punching up thing generally, because I think it requires that you constantly maintain some sort of hierarchy in your head and are hyper vigilant about which direction you're punching. And I think if you're going to be a comedian, you just got to punch, you just punch around until you find something that's funny and like, oh, that's funny. Like, okay, great. Oh, that one bombed. I shouldn't say anything about like whatever this is right now, right? So it's too early to make AIDS jokes or whatever it is, right? So yeah, I mean,
I know we're way over. Can I say one more thing?
Okay, what?
So this just gets to the epitome of what the problem with the SJW comedy is. This was a year ago. I was in an argument with someone who is a former friend, or I think she's still a social media friend, but when I was in the SJW world, an SJW friend, and I was talking about how SNL is like so weak the past few years, and they only hit at the obvious targets like Trump. They don't do anything like the YouTube kids are doing. They're not subversive. If they were, they had Matt Damon playing Kavanaugh, right? They would have had Dana Carvey on playing Christine Blasey Ford, but they didn't because they're cowards. Anyway, a year ago, they had this sketch video with all the women in the cast, and it was like a music video called "Welcome to Hell," and you can find it online probably. And it was basically the joke of it was, I guess, supposed to be that it's horrible to be a woman. We have to carry pepper spray at night. It was like a bunch of stuff that we have to do because it's so hard to be a woman. And I posted it and I was like, I just want to know, does anyone think this is funny? Even if you agree with the message, do you think it's funny?
Right.
And this one friend the SJW friend, she started arguing with me and she basically goes, I don't know if humor was the driving force as much as the message. I'm like, yes, that's my point. That's my point. And then we kept going back and forth. She goes, this is later on. I didn't find it particularly funny, but I'm going to chalk this up as this weak on comedy, strong on message sketch is a win. And she goes on to write about how it's more important for the message to, we need to disrupt, and we're living in a world where people's lives are in danger. This is that whole hyperbolic thing they do again. But anyway, she kept repeating what I was saying, which is that it's not funny, but to her, it's okay because the message is important. Well, that's convergence. That's SJW convergence in comedy, where you see the ideology is now more important than the humor. So, and they don't care. They're fine because the message is on point. Is it funny? No, but the preaching is right. They're preaching what we like.
Right. And this is what will ultimately kill a lot of companies, right? Is it profitable? No, but the message is on point. I'm like, all right, well, eventually that'll die. So by the way, Jason says that Godfrey Elfwick was a great satirical troll who mocked SJWs on Twitter for a while. I don't know who that was. I did paste Titania McGrath's URL in there. She's like a fake SJW who's hilarious on Twitter as well. Totally over the top. I think follow.
She might be run by the same woman who used to do Godfrey. So Godfrey Elfwick was hilarious. He was a fake SJW. He posted that he was trans race, Muslim. Like he just had this whole list of things where he was in the wrong skin, and he used all of their arguments against them. But he was so good that a lot of times SJWs thought he was for real, and they would like tweet him. They would retweet him because they agreed with him. But it was so over the top. He got banned. Of course, he got banned because he was.
Oh, he got banned.
He got banned repeatedly, and I think the only place you can find him now is probably on Facebook. He's not. And it's a woman. There's an article. Look up Godfrey Elfwick. It ended up that it was a woman the whole time writing it, who's hilarious.
Well, if it's the same person, still hilarious. I mean, Titania McGrath is similar, and she's so good at it that a lot of non-SJWs get into like heated arguments with her.
Yes, I think it's the same person.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. So on that note, thank you everyone for watching. Keri, I don't know if we know what we're doing next week, but we might be interviewing someone about racism next week who wrote an article, but not totally clear. But anyway, thanks everyone.
Let's just watch a bunch of the SJW non-approved Christmas specials. And so
oh yes, we will do a Christmas special where we're going to go through Baby It's Cold Outside, and I think they're upset about Charlie Brown too or something. I don't know. So we'll ruin your Christmas as well, we promise. So all right, well, thanks everyone for watching. Really appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter at Unsafe Show. You can go to unsafeshow.com. We've got a Facebook page. We've got a couple of Facebook pages. There's an Unsafe Space page, and there's a Deprogrammed page, which is this show, which is on every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. So join us. You can also find podcasts of Unsafe Space. Deprogrammed is on the Unsafe Space podcast. So please do what you can to support the show. Even just liking and sharing is super valuable. So thanks everyone, and we will catch you next time.